There are some aspects of poetry that can seem quite intimidating. There's a lot of technical vocabulary that goes with it. And I think if we're going to really seriously explore the value of poetry at times of stress, then we need to learn a little bit about how poetry works. And indeed, one of the things we'll find is that that very word, stress, and its opposite, unstressed, plays an important part in how poetry is put together. In order to help me explore some of these ideas, I've got with me the author of what in the old days would have been called a manual of English prosody. Prosody is the technical term for how poems are put together, the technical aspects of it. But it's not actually called a manual of English prosody. It's called the ODE Less Travelled, Unlocking the Poet Within. And it's by a poetry fanatic, someone who's been privately writing poetry pretty well all his life, Stephen Fry.
Hi,
Stephen,
yeah.
Welcome. Yeah, I loved this book. I absolutely loved it. I remember reading old George Saintsbury's Manual of English Prosody, written 100 years ago, and it was not quite as accessible as your approach.
No, it's an interesting thing. Sometimes people imagine that poetry is just about putting down all your feelings, and that's all you need to do, and then that's valid and it's good. And occasionally that can work, and that's called free verse. As you know, it has no particular form or structure that's laid down. And I can't argue with that. I love a lot of free verse. Walt Whitman, T.S. Eliot, some of their verses free and as good as anything ever written. But a lot of verse that's written uses, you mentioned the word stress, uses the nature of the English language, which comes in beats, whether you know it or not. I haven't time to take your call right now, so leave a message when you hear the tone. That happens to be 2 lines of iambic pentameter. Most people are familiar with that. You may not necessarily know what it is. It's what Shakespeare's written in.
Exactly. It's, it seems to catch the rhythm of English speech. I mean, one of my favourite examples, very famous 18th century poem, Thomas Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard. And it begins, "The curfew tolls the knell of parting day, dee-dum, dee-dum, dee-dum." And it's, you say, you have a lovely phrase in your book. You say, the life of a poem is measured in regular heartbeats. The name for those heartbeats is meter.
That's right. That's metrical verse. Meter, it's just the Greek for measure, and it's how you count it out. In America, the word measure is used for what we call a bar in music, in English. And if you think of music, it's a good comparison. Nobody would imagine that the way to express yourself musically is to go to a piano or guitar and just do this without knowing what you're doing. You have basically a sense of rhythm. Is it in 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, which would be a waltz? Or is it 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4? Is it 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2? You know, we all know that's sort of the most likely way to play music. And then we have to know a few technical words like chord or something. And really it's no different in poetry. The only thing that's different is we use language all the time. We use it to order up pizza on the phone. We order it to ask someone to pass the mustard. It seems strange to be told how to regiment it in order to express it at its finest and most complex, which is a poem. And yet, I think it's actually liberating. And a lot of poets have thought this. Wordsworth is a good example. He wrote a poem on the nature of the sonnet, this scanty plot of ground. And if you imagine you had to plant a row of flowers, and you were given a small area, then you'd think very hard about how to do it. And the result would be rather wonderful. If you're given a huge field, what on earth do you do then? A great open field. And oddly enough, open field is a word for an American style of free verse. Charles Olson and others wrote this open field poetry.
Which was a reaction against regular
It was,
yeah.
and all that is, of course, completely valid. And it's important to remember that there are ultimately no rules about poetry, except what either pleases you as a reader, what you connect with, what makes sense to you, or what, as someone who's trying to write poetry, makes it easier for you to express what it is you want to express, because the words are the only things you have to make a poem. And people have played around with all kinds of things to do with words, whether how they look on the page. Concrete poetry, as it's sometimes called, which makes shapes and which reflect the feelings of the poem or the meaning of the poem, perhaps, I think a very good example is the Thomas Hardy poem, which has a rather typically Hardy, pompous title, because it's about the Titanic. And it's called The Convergence of the Twain, about the meeting of this great ocean liner and the iceberg, and how they were destined and doomed to meet, which is a very Hardy-esque sort of thing, isn't it? This doom, this inevitability. But each stanza, each verse, actually looks like a ship. It's got a long line at the top and then sort of shorter ones down to the bottom. And it's very, very pleasing how you can do that without overdoing.
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing thing about form, isn't it? I mean, certainly, if we think about the Western tradition, our ideas of poetry literature go back to the ancient Greeks. And the fact is, for 2,500 years, until the advent of free verse, people thought it valuable to put their best thoughts into poetic form with very rigorous meters and rules. I mean, as you say, a lot of the terms, the formal terms, go back to the ancient Greeks. They're then imitated by the Romans, and then through the Renaissance and Shakespeare's time and so on, right down until the so-called modernist revolution. Everybody always used form, used meter. And there's something about the line as the unit of verse that's particularly important, isn't there?
The line is absolutely right, and as a lot of people might have thought when confronting modern poetry, that it seems to be randomly chopped lines because they're no longer following the rule of 10 syllables, for example, which would be a pentameter, and instead they seem to go this, and then will be the line that then stops. And in a good poem, it's very provocative and interesting how it's done, but in the formal poetry, the line is in a sense how the sense is expressed and the way it flows or doesn't flow and stops and doesn't stop. But a lot of people would say, of course, that it was the rules were there because that's how you learnt a poem. Indeed. The rhythm taught you how to learn it. If it weren't rhythmic and it didn't rhyme, it would be a lot harder to learn, wouldn't it?
Now that brings us to one of your rules in your book, which is how valuable it is A, to read poetry slowly, and B, to read it aloud. And of course, if you're ever struggling with the rhythm or the meter, read it aloud and you discover from the natural stresses of the words, you just discover the rhythm. So why slowly and why aloud? Well,
poets put poems together very slowly. There are a few famous exceptions to that. Keats wrote a sonnet, the Grasshopper and the Cricket, apparently, in about 20 minutes. But generally speaking, they're very, very slowly put together, and the words are all kind of balanced and shaped like a beautiful object, and they need to be looked at, inspected, felt in the mouth, in the eyes, and of course with the intellect, but mostly with the emotion. There are all kinds of different ways of engaging with it. And I'd recommend taking a poem. It can be the most famous poem in the world. It can be, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? And taking it to bed and reading it every night for a couple of weeks. And it won't have given up all its goodness. That there is so much, as it were, nutrition, emotional and intellectual, inside the best poems. And the ones that are famous, I always think it's silly to be embarrassed about reading a poem like Country Churchyard by Thomas Gray that you mentioned, the elegy, or Shakespeare's 18th Sonnet, for example. Nothing to be embarrassed about taking one that's incredibly well known. It could be the Charge of the Light Brigade. It could be a Keats ode, and just seeing why it's stood the test of time, much as you might want to go and look at Mona Lisa when you're in Paris. It's silly not to. It might be annoying having all the tourists there, but it hasn't taken away its value. And because those are well-known ones, and because you probably know most of the words of them already, at least the beginnings of them, it becomes yours. It becomes your friend. You know it. You know every line of it, and you question why has he done that? That's very odd. And I think that you can't be too slow with a poem, and that's one of the values they have for you.
Obviously, one of the ways in which poetry achieves form and a sense of harmony and completion, one of the ways in which a poetic couplet can be like a kiss, two lines joining, is through rhyme. Poetry doesn't have to rhyme, but many of the greatest poems do. What are your views on rhyme?
I think you have to be you have to have a good ear. And sometimes even the great poets didn't have a good ear. I mean, there's a famous Lucy poems of Wordsworth about her grave. I measured it from side to side. It was 6'5" and 4 foot wide, or whatever. You know, you just go, that's so terrible. You can't write that in a serious poem. I don't know why. You just can't. I think most people would giggle if they heard that. And I think obviously avoiding clichéic rhymes. There's so many that draw attention to themselves as moon and June and whatever, you know, sort of love and. There are only a few words that rhyme with love, and they've really pretty much used up dove and above and of in lyrics. I think a lot of poets, a good example is the great Philip Larkin and also Wilfred Owen, use what is called partial slant rhyme, where it can just be the consonants that rhyme. So port would rhyme with pint, say, or heart with hunt. You just got that, or you can have rhymes where the vowels in the middle rhyme. So you could have heart and far, or something like that. You know, just a gentle rhyme, just a gentle suggestion of connection between the lines that somehow stops it being. I suppose in our culture now, because we're so used to every rhyme that's possible, it stops it being a bit pat, you know, a bit sort of ha-ha. You know? Yeah,
so the thought is sort of held together in unity. There's a kind of harmony, but as you say, it's not an over-easy resolution.
No, that's right, exactly. And I suppose we live in a time ever since the age of anxiety, ever since, the First World War, modernism, you know, where sort of easy conclusions are just something not part of our culture anymore.
Yeah. The other thing about the line, you said this a moment ago, is that one of the things all great poets do is a mix between lines that are stop at the end, so-called end-stopped lines, that are where the unit of the sense falls in with the unit of the line, and lines that run on across the line ending. We use this technical term enjambment for that, a French word. You know, Macbeth, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. It's a single line, creeps in this petty pace from day to the last syllable of recorded time, and you start running across the line endings. Do you think that that sort of balance between the stopped line and the run-on line what's going on with that? Why does that seem such an effective device?
It's a really good point, and actually in this book, not that I'm asking anyone to read it or go to a library and refer to it, but it's just an example that struck me very strongly. There's a speech, Leontes in A Winter's Tale, which is astonishing. It has the famous line about Sir Smile, the neighbour, and sluicing the pond, and it's a hideous thing of this jealous man suddenly believing that his wife is having an affair with his friend. And there's a section of it which happens to be about 14 lines, like a sonnet. And every single line is an enjambment, is a flowing through. And in the middle it has a hard pause, a caesura as they're called, as you know. And so it goes... It's all correct, if you want to use that word, in terms of its meter, but it's severely fractured. And the point is that Pericles at this point is going mad. Leontes at this point is going mad. He is severely disturbed. He's having a kind of psychotic episode, essentially. And the lines of the poetry are doing that. They're showing that as clearly as can possibly be. And if you compare it to the one I've just mentioned, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, thou art more lovely and more temperate, there isn't a single enjambment in that whole 14-line sonnet. Because it's laid out as clear, thought-through facts. I know what's going on. You are not like the summer, because the summer will fade. Spring, summer, they all fade, they all change, everything dies. But no, not you. You're not going to die because you're in this poem, and that's going to live forever. An act of breathtaking conceit from Shakespeare. But of course, as we're talking about it now, he was quite right.
Yeah. And the other thing, of course, for line ending is it gives you that pause. I think one of the great poets for those enjambed or run-on lines is Wordsworth. It's a wonderful line where he's talking about listening for the sound of an owl. And he has a line, and while I hung at the end of a line, listening in the next line. And you hang for a moment in the pause. The pause, the blank space at the end of a line just makes you pause, it makes you slow down, and then the thought's completed.
Yes, and another one, great one at that, is Wilfred Owen, who is worth looking at again, because almost certainly people look at Wilfred Owen with a view to his disgust and at war, and of course that is the main feeling that comes from it. It's easy perhaps not to notice what an extraordinary craftsman he is. He's truly in the tradition of Keats as one of the most gifted prosodic craftsmen that the English language can boast. And so a lot of his effects are a perfect example of how the powerful emotion, and there can hardly have been a more powerful emotion than the feeling he had in the middle of that appalling war, was channeled into a technical expression of poetry, which has rarely been surpassed. And some people may think that that's a bit of a contradiction, that if you're feeling that emotional, you wouldn't then stop to package it in such perfect poetic form. But actually that is the great, perhaps counterintuitive achievement of all art, is that it often seems the more structured it is, and the more, there's a thing we might come to when talking about emotion in particular and feeling in poetry, which is a famous phrase of T.S. Eliot's, which is one that people have puzzled over and sounds a bit grand and intellectual, which is an objective correlative. And it's quite hard to explain really, because partly because I don't really understand it, but I glimpse what it means, which is something to do with emotion having to be earned. It can't just be put out there. And in good poems, emotion isn't just splurged out in a wail or a moan or a rage or whatever the emotion may be. It's controlled and it's held back usually, and then it may come strongly, but it's the very fact that it's channeled into chosen words makes it so powerful and indeed so enduring. Otherwise it's a tantrum, and great poetry isn't a tantrum as a rule, unless you're talking of Ginsberg's Howl, perhaps.
Yeah, I suppose the other aspect of the objective correlative is exactly that idea of finding something exterior, finding an object, an image. Yeah. Typically, I mean, poetry is so often made of images that somehow speaks to your interior state.
Yes.
You know, why is it poets are so fascinated by nature? Because in nature around us, whether it's the roll of a wave of the sea or the sound of a storm or the flight of a skylark, somehow nature can give us external images which are evocative of internal moods. They become symbolic
and, yes, exactly. There's another famous phrase, also two words, which is used often to describe that sense of the poet immersing himself in nature, not in order to glorify nature, but to find some truth about himself. The egotistical sublime is the phrase that is often used. And it's rather nice, because it seems like it's contradictory. If it's egotistical, how can it be sublime?
Yes, well, of course, that was Keats's term for the thing that he sort of admired, but also didn't admire in Wordsworth, which was exactly, because Wordsworth was the great poet of projecting his own feelings into external nature. Keats sometimes felt that there was a bit too much of that. And he proposed this alternative phrase, negative capability.
Yes.
What do you understand by negative capability?
That, you imagine it somehow subsuming yourself into things. It's a phrase that I find, I find it really, really useful sometimes to describe even, it sounds appalling, a betrayal of high art, a piece of technology, for example. There's a recent new piece of technology that's come out, and people say, what's it like? What's it like? How does it work? I say, well, the strange thing is, it's all its achievements are in it subsumes itself. You don't notice it, and it finds an achievement through its lack of presence, which is subsuming the egotistical into presumably. Is that what he meant?
I think it's part of what he meant. I think the other thing, and this sort of relates to the idea of the possibility of poetry as a kind of stress management tool, is he describes negative capability as the opposite of a state of irritably reaching after fact and reason. The idea that, you know, sometimes we want an answer. We're always sort of thinking about the next thing. But negative, it's almost like a state of karma, of inner calm.
Yes.
You're just content to sort of let it be. And often the best poetic moments do seem to be exactly that. They're moments where you're content to reside in the moment without this, you know, looking to the future.
Yes, and I would say, I would add to that there is a deep sense that poetry tries to achieve or find the reality of things, not of ideas. That the reason it looks at nature, the reason it looks at rocks and water, and the reason it might look at a small thing, a chair or a pair of shoes, is because it finds reality in those things, not in the abstract. And that the idea that poetry is an ethereal thing, that looks at the sky and ideas and the glory of this or the terror of that, is that it's tested on the pulses, indeed, as Keats would say. It's tested on the whatness of things, the quiddity of things, as it's sometimes called.
Gerard Manley Hopkins uses this word inscape, doesn't he? The idea of what just somehow arresting the essence of a thing, a movement, a moment.
Indeed, absolutely. And it's the fingernailness of a fingernail is crucial. And in a sense, that's poets are like other artists in that sense. Painters are constantly striving to find the absolute essence of what it is they're painting. Cézanne would bore his friends endlessly talking about how to achieve a tomato on a canvas. And as we know, he probably did that sort of thing better than anyone who's ever lived. But it's no accident that he did it better than anyone who lived, because he thought about it more than anyone who lived.
And he practiced, which comes back to the craft. I mean, there's that sense that we can all write poetry because we all have language. It's something you say in the book. But we can't necessarily all write good poetry, but we can develop a craft. What tips would you have for someone just wanting to try their hand at putting feelings, thoughts, moments into verse?
I would suggest they might look at their favourite poem that has form, and it can be I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, it can be a sonnet, it can be an ottava rima or something. They don't have to know what the form is, but just observe it and look at it, count the syllables and the beats in each line, and then write out a sort of grid, and then do a silly verse that fits it exactly. And then think, well, okay, I'm going to write a poem about that. It could be about my daily commute. It could be about anything, really. But just try out writing in that form. And I think people amaze themselves when they do that. Whereas if you just sit sucking a pen and thinking, I want to write a poem, here's a blank sheet of paper. What do I do? There's no grid. And I would emphasize, Jonathan, and I'm sure you'd agree, that I am in no way devaluing free verse that doesn't have form. It's just that you, by definition, can't give any advice about it, because it's up to the.
But in a sense, you do need to earn it, don't you? I mean, it's very striking. I mean, even with a great poet like Shakespeare, he actually begins with very, very regular forms. I mean, in early Shakespeare, there's a lot more rhyme. There's a lot more end-stopped lines. His verse gets freer as he goes on, but he earns it. And all the great poets, they become poets through reading poetry and through learning, often very overtly imitating the techniques of existing poets. Then eventually they find their own voice, they find their own freedom. Just as with a musician or a painter, a painter has to start by doing life classes and basic drawing stuff. A musician has to learn by actually learning some chords. Yes, once you've got the basic techniques, then you're free to break the rules.
Exactly. I couldn't agree with you more. It's drawing, life classes, they're pretty obvious. Not everyone agrees with them, but I think the best comparison is music. No one would suggest that you can learn the guitar by ignoring Western harmony. It's not going to happen, you know. And we've all probably had friends who go around saying, "Oh, I've got this new D9th. Have you seen how that works?" And they'd show you, and you go, "Oh, wow, that's amazing. Oh, well, how about this one here, C7th?" And I go, "Oh, God, that's really good." And somehow it's rather cool when you do that with music. Yeah, I learned that on the guitar. That's really fun. But when you say, "Oh, have you seen this new anapaestic line?" or whatever, they go, it doesn't have quite the drama to it somehow. There's a talking of anapaests, which is a perfect example of a Greek word for
half a league, half a league, half a league onward. Those are anapaestic, aren't they?
Yes, there's a very funny you can find on YouTube. Robert Browning, who was invited to dinner, was surprised to have the inventor of a phonograph type thing, a bit like he was a rival of Edison's, and he asked Browning to record something on it, and he wrote a poem called "How I Brought the Good News from Ghent to Aix," which is in anapaest, and it's supposed to represent the horses thundering, because it's I sprang to the stirrup and Joris and he, I galloped, we galloped all three, Godspeed cried the postern as the gate bolts withdrew, speed echoed the walls to us galloping through. And anyway, he starts like that and he goes, "I sprang to the stirrup and Joris and he, I galloped, we galloped all three," because he'd completely forgotten it. But the rhythm took him to the end. It's rather charming. It's very sweet.